I'll maybe just go through a few introductory bits. Firstly, this session has been put on jointly between the Green Party's Green Left group, the Green Party's Trade Union group, and the Greenhouse think tank, all of who have stalls in the main hall for those who are interested. And the main reason it's being put on jointly is because there are people within them, including myself and Pete, who are working together in another organisation outside the Green Party called the Lucas Plan Working Group, which is looking at the Lucas Aerospace Plan, not the Caroline Lucas Plan, the Lucas Aerospace Plan from the 1976, which was workers organising to create plans of how they could transition the workplace towards green jobs. And here we are 40 years later, still talking about the same things and still trying to make plans to put that into practice. Apologies today from Jenny Patient of Sheffield Climate Alliance, Isabel Tarr from Coal Action UK. The names that are in the programme are the provisional list of speakers at the event before we got permission to run a Fringe, rather than the actual list, which you then ring around to see who can make it once they've decided what time on what day they've allocated you to. So we are who we are, and we are who we're here. For those who are interested in what Jenny Patient from Sheffield Climate Alliance has to say, the Sheffield Climate Alliance plus Greenhouse plus the Centre for Alternative Technology are organising a whole weekend on how to create a zero carbon Yorkshire, which is the last weekend of October. And if you want a flyer for that, you'll find it on the Greenhouse stall, or you can just check it out online. In terms of who we have here today, to my left is Sam. Second name? Blank. Sam Mason, who's the Climate Change Policy Officer for the PCS Trade Union, and also in the Just Transition Working Group for the Lucas Plan. And to my far left, from us to use such a word in the Green Party, is Peter Sims, who's been working with myself in Greenhouse doing a plan for the Isle of Wight, which is a plan to localise the 1 million climate jobs campaign created by the Campaign Against Climate Change Trade Union Group, to see how that would look in one place like the Isle of Wight, and how we can then use it as a tool for a local Green Party to start to campaign locally on economic and jobs issues as a way of trying to make some progress on the environment and the social arena. Pete here is proposing to film, so if any of you would like to remain anonymous and not in a potential Green Party video for whatever reason, just come and see myself or Pete at the end, and he said he's got the technology to edit anyone out. So if you want to be edited out, to be edited in or out. No payments required, I understand. So without further ado, may I introduce. Okay, so the format of the session is Sam's going to speak first to give an overall perspective on what's called the just transition, about how we transition the workplace in terms of climate change. And then we're going to hand over to Peter, who's going to run through the Isle of Wight climate jobs plan. If you have any direct questions about what they're saying at that moment in time, which might get lost in the melee of half an hour later, then both have said they're happy for you to put up a hand and clarify something that they're discussing. I'm suggesting we leave a decent question and answer session to the end, and then we can try to involve both angles, the national and the local, together.
One other point, there's a piece of paper with name and email and tick boxes for various mailing lists going round, so that will come round at some point, and if it could get passed over from one side to the other at the appropriate moment.
So if you want to be on a mailing list, I suggest you capitalise the email address, because I've done this before and you have that 1 in 5 failures because you can't simply read someone's writing. Otherwise you won't work on any mailing list, but the mailing list on the end are to join Green Left, Green Party Trade Union Group, the Lucas Plan Working Group, which is the email list, or the Greenhouse mailing list, which will give you notice of when we publish something going forward. And if you want a copy of the Isle of Wight reports, we've got a couple for perusal, which are here. There are also display copies on the Greenhouse stall. You can download them. And we do have some flyers for the short version of the Just Transition report from PCS, if you want to take them away at the end. Over to you, Sam.
Okay, well, I'll stand up just in case you can't hear me, but it's nice for me to see everybody. And I'd just like to say thank you, Jonathan and Pete, for inviting me along to this session, because I think it's actually quite an interesting time at the moment, because we've been talking about just transition for a very long time, and whilst we've had great ideas around like the Lucas plan for nearly coming up for 41 years, obviously we've not seen much happen. But so I just want to start off with mentioning one thing in particular. Many of you who are close to trade union debates will know that we've been stuck in a very binary position of what we'd like to call jobs versus the environment for a very long time, and that's created a number of difficulties. And anyone who similarly has followed debates at Trade Union Congress would have known last year in 2016 there was a very fractious debate on this, on a climate change motion that was brought to TEC Congress. Fortunately, as the saying goes, what a difference a year makes, and this year we had a motion that came to TEC Congress brought by the Bakers Union, who are the union that are currently leading the protest against McDonald's at the moment and their bad work practices, that was unanimously passed, and that was very historic in labour movement terms, partly because obviously it was unanimously passed and the number of unions standing up to speak in support of that motion was quite incredible, and unions that not normally have spoken on this area before, such as the Shop Workers Union, for example. Obviously, we're very pleased and commend the Bakers Union for bringing such a motion, because agriculture and the whole food sector, as you will know, generally gets left out a lot of the debate and discussion on climate change and just transition issues. But there are probably four things in that motion just to mention. One is about fighting for the public ownership and democratic control of our energy system, which is the topic of the pamphlet which PCS has produced. A mass retrofit programme, so in energy conservation across all our buildings, industrial strategy, and just transition. And just transition is absolutely key. I don't know how many people understand that terms. I know we're quite often used to speaking in our own jargon in our own organisations, but just transition, generally speaking, is understood to be and including at the international trade union level, of a number of social protections to make sure that obviously workers don't pay the price in the transition that we need to a low or zero carbon economy. Now that's as fine as far as it goes, but until we start to achieve this, so as much as we have, it's great that we've got this TEC Congress motion, workers are not going to down their fossil fuel tools tomorrow unless we can give them confidence that there is something on the other side of that and real jobs to go to. So on the one level, yes, we think the low carbon economy will be a real job creator, but we have to make sure that we've got a really clear path on how we get there. And the example that I and many others now like to give is obviously in the coal industry in the 80s and 90s. Now, we won't be fighting for those jobs as such today, but obviously that was a major transition to a service economy, and we know what happened there, and we are living today seeing the results of very devastated communities with poor work, precarious work, etc. And that was affected over 250,000 workers in its day. So we know what an unjust transition looks like and the mistakes that we need to avoid. But how do we go about achieving this is one of the big issues now. From my PCS hat as a policy officer there, we have produced what we call a Just Transition, Energy, Democracy, a Civil Service Trade Union perspective. One reason why we produce this is because we don't have members directly in the fossil fuel sectors. So we tend to come up with a bit of a buffer that, well, it's okay for you, your members don't work in the energy sector. Well, that is true, and I understand it's going to mean something very different from those working in, for example, the North Sea offshore oil and gas industry than what it does for our members. But from our perspective, energy is everybody's business. The power sector is one of the most carbon emitting sectors, so we need to deal with that. And as a civil service trade union, our members work in a lot of the regulatory policy and monitoring functions of government that's going to make this transition happening. So we need to make sure we engage our members in this debate and put our space within this debate. And part of that too means it is going to be a job creator. At the moment, we have the smallest civil service since the Second World War. They've absolutely hollowed out a number of high level of expertise and functions within the civil service, but that's not just the civil service, that's right across the public sector and in local authorities as well. So in the terms of our energy transition, what we have argued for, that we need national planning. This is the only way we're going to achieve such a transition to basically what we call energy democracy, which means 100% renewable energy that deals also with social issues such as fuel poverty and retrofitting and all these other elements that go into that. We don't believe that the market will create this transition that we need. We've already seen that there's a mass gap in terms of the capital investment that we need for a transition, which came out the Paris Climate Agreement. The trillions of dollars that are needed to institute that are actually going backwards, and there is research that's going to come out in a little while that does a really good analysis of that. So therefore, we also, going more back to the Lucas plan, what's really important is that workers are going to drive the transformation that we need. We've got 31 million workers in this country at the moment. So they've all got a stake in the transition. So whilst it's very clear that you have workers more clearly within fossil fuels, obviously in construction, in the public sector, in even, as I mentioned, the bakers union, so even in your fast food areas and stuff like this, everybody's going to have a stake. So the low carbon economy isn't just about the very specific energy workers who are extracting the fossil fuels at the moment. So we need to know what that means. And we're not the only country or unions that are trying to grapple with what this transition means in reality. There's really good studies that are coming out of Canada now. Ireland have done their own studies. There's lots of energy and lots of work around this, but it is that question of how do we make it actually happen, because we, as much as we can produce these really nice documents, as long as they sit on, our shelves in our offices or just distributed at meetings, that's not going to take us very far. So we need to start creating those real jobs, which for us is where the industrial strategy part comes in. At the moment, under the Tory government, we've got an industrial strategy, which is really a number of very sort of infrastructure projects like the Northern Powerhouse, that are big sort of grand things that really don't sit together as any holistic kind of pathway to our low energy economy. So it's absolutely critical that government and workers and industry get together and decide and start shaping what does that actually look like, and start putting the mechanisms in place to start doing that. Alongside that, there needs to be the protections in place for workers, and that means doing some things like repealing some of the anti-trade union legislation, because actually that is stopping workers organised, making sure that workers are actively engaged in these discussions, whether that's through workplace reps. But even in the workplace, we advocate as well, and this is across the trade union movement, for a statutory right for workplace environmental reps, so that they can actually workers can have a say in their own workplaces about measures around energy efficiency, travel policies, etc., which is all part of it. But for PCS, one of the things we've spelt out in our plan is actually changing the machinery of government, because until we change some of the governmental institutions that oversee this, then we are not going to have a coordinated, joined-up government for this. So drawing on the ideas of the National Climate Service, which is part of the 1 Million Climate Jobs campaign, what we actually articulate and set out in here, and it's not intended as a blueprint, but just some ideas of what a National Climate Service would actually look like. So, for example, where we currently have our Department for Work and Pensions, we'd have a Ministry for Jobs, Skills and Social Protection. So rather than having job centres at the moment that are handing out sanctions, and obviously there are some nasty things that they have to do, that are actually working collectively and regionally and locally with people to actually transform their areas. So, for example, one thing that obviously makes absolutely no sense is the fracking up in Lancashire at the moment and on the file. The 1 Million Climate Jobs booklet outlined how you'd have more jobs in climate jobs than you would in fracking. Obviously, the whole resource of offshore wind there that could be developed and really create a good local economy with good and sustainable jobs, because it's also important that in the transition and the job creation, that the jobs are long term. Obviously, some jobs, as ever in construction, are not going to last for long periods of time. But for example, in retrofitting jobs, I know there's some criticism that these are not going to be long-term sustainable jobs, but you can actually go back to some of the ideas of when you had direct labour organisations in local authorities, for example, so doing your maintenance, and can be putting on your solar panels. And people tell me, even in local energy, one of the big lack at the moment is people working on the maintenance side. So it's okay once you've got the stuff up and running, but then people to oversee it doesn't exist. So that there are lots of big areas, but obviously this takes a form of national level planning to make sure all this does happen. I think, just to be clear as well, when we talk about national level planning, we're not talking about sort of centralised Whitehall bureaucracies. We very much, and this is where the energy democracy side comes in, about how you get the transition distilled down to the local areas, in the regions, obviously in devolved nations as well, with real community involvement. So again, you don't have a situation like in Lancashire where you can have the Secretary of State sitting in London overall the local consensus and opinion on their energy generation in that area. So we think that's really critical and really important, and of itself that obviously will create new institutions, new bodies, and obviously there is a recognition that renewables, energy efficiency work is more labour intensive than the current fossil fuel, coal-fired or gas-fired generation at the moment. So there definitely will be jobs there, but we have to be honest about which jobs. There will be jobs that go. The United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change sets out 4 things that, being honest about the job losses, the new jobs, the repurposed jobs where people be re-skilled, but sort of coming back to sort of Ministry of Job Skills and Social Protections. Again, it's making sure that people in the local job centres, if we imagine how they are now, but in a future with a more purposeful role, will actually be working with local businesses or workers about what those skills are and having real supported programmes of transition. There is a little bit of this happening in Scotland at the moment. They have a transition fund and some support for workers coming out of the offshore oil and gas industry, but it's not enough. A lot of workers up there are losing their jobs, and it's a real shame at the moment that there isn't a clear plan. Obviously, regardless of climate change and energy targets, those jobs are going to go in the North Sea, and there is no plan at the moment how you transition those workers out into new jobs and working with them. So that is really important. Although there are important initiatives underway in Scotland, which I hope will start to resonate down, obviously, for the rest of the UK in their announcement to establish a Just Transition Commission and start defining what that looks like, and other things up there, and sort of local energy companies. And I don't know if it's time for me to finish, but in case it is, I think the other thing, just to say what's really important for PCS and also as part of the Lucas plan work, is that when the Lucas plan looked at alternative corporate plan, it was about socially useful production, and obviously there's these discussions about growth, and we need to look at growth in terms of social growth and what people are actually doing, and that's where also it's about sustainable jobs, is meaningful jobs. And the Just Transition has to, what we say is we don't want a zero carbon economy with 0 hours contracts. We want a kind of re-looking at the inequality that's inherent in our current system to make sure the new jobs actually deal with a number of those issues. So I think I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And